Thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited to invite you to this launch of the new WEPs Deep-dive series that the WEPs Global Secretariat is introducing to the WEPs community. My name is Miwa Park, and I am the WEPs coordinator at the Women's Empowerment Principal, or WEPs in short, Secretariat at the UN Women. The WEPs Deep Dive series was developed to take web signatories and web supporters into a thematic discussion on the gender equality and women's empowerment topics. This series will dedicate to widening and deepening your knowledge on different themes related to gender equality. And for those of you who participated in our webinar in November on the G20 Gender Power Gap may recall a survey that we've launched during the event. We asked you for your suggestion on the themes for future webinars. So this is a series that came as a result of your ideas and suggestions, really. What you'd like to learn more on gender equality and women's empowerment. So please stay tuned for the future series. And if you have additional ideas, please share with us in the chat. So for today's webinar, we'll explore gender equality and gender equity and learn about the laws working for women in business. We've invited a very special guest from the Women, Business and the Law team of the World Bank, and she'll explain further about their research findings, so I won't go into details. Then we have also invited 3 web signatories for a roundtable discussion on their work on gender equality. So we'll first hear from some introductory remarks from UN Women as usual, then invite the guest from World Bank to present her Women, Business and the Law. And after this backdrop, we will invite representatives from the web signatories to share their journeys on navigating through legal frameworks for women. So please stay tuned until the very end. We also like to hear from you in the audience. So we have prepared chat function so you can interact with, share your questions and interact with your participant through Q&A function and chat at the bottom of the screen. And if you'd like to communicate with other participants again, please use the chat function. Sorry, I mixed up Q&A and chat. So your question will be answered during the Q&A session or through the chat throughout the webinar. So also please note that this webinar is being recorded and later it'll be uploaded to the website.org website to share with the general public. So to get us started, I'd like to invite Anna Falt, the Global Head of Women's Empowerment Principles, Global Secretariat at the UN Women, to provide some opening remarks. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's a very exciting discussion that we have in the next hour, focusing on laws that impact women throughout their lives. And when we talk about throughout their lives, we are talking about before they enter into the labor market, the laws that prevent or even stereotypes and other biases in society that shapes women's choices before they even start education, before they go into the labor market. Then we are talking about laws that impact women during their working lives, and also the impact on women after they leave the labor market. There's some of the issues that we will hear from Daniela, or I can cluster them under the 3 pillars of the Women's Empowerment Principle, which is workplace. She'll cover some issues related to pay, marriage, parenthood, but also the issues as a consequence of some discriminatory laws or practices around the world. She'll also touch upon pension, and that will be very interesting to see the result of women's work on the impact when women enter into older age and into retirement. The marketplace, she will touch upon entrepreneurship and women's access to assets. And the community, I think here we see the impact of women's mobility, opportunities of mobility that have impact both on the workplace and the marketplace, and how that limit women's economic opportunities. But we also wanted to take an opportunity because we have received a lot of questions from you. What are we using gender equality and gender equity as synonyms? Or is there a difference? So we thought that today we'll also just briefly touch upon some concepts that relates to gender equality. So we can go to the next slide. Yes. So I found this image on the internet, and I think it fits very well to explaining these different concepts. So today, the reality is that a few people have much more than other people. They have more than they actually need, as explained by the first image. Then equality is assuming that everyone benefits in the same way. But equality is what we ultimately want to achieve. But how do we get there? So the concept of equity is then that we give the support to people where they need it. And this is where affirmative action comes in. I'm sure you're all familiar with the discussion on quota for women on boards, etc. So this is to help even out the inequalities that are there. The risk with this concept of equity, that it leaves a room for interpretation for lawmakers and others to say, oh, women don't need so much land. So because they are not the head of household, let's say. So it's a little bit, it's a very complex concept of equity. Who decides who needs what? And here it's consultations are very, very important to be able to proceed with the concept of equity and run with the equity. So it's quite different. On this image, we also see justice. And as you see here, the wall to the game has been removed. So here's when the root causes have been addressed. The systemic barriers have been removed. So if we have challenges of women in the labor market, that might be because of the unevenness in caring for children, elderly, and other type of care work. Once those root causes have been removed, women are more have more opportunities to engage. And then the last slide is on inclusion, where we allow everyone to participate, and no one has been left on the outside. So I hope that this clarifies a little bit the questions that we have received from our community. But ultimately, what we would like to see is that we have equal opportunities for women and men and other genders and other categories. But the path to get there is through affirmative action and the concept of equity. So I hope I will leave it at that, and we'll move on to the presentation by Daniela. So back to you, Miwa. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for your wonderful opening remarks. And now I'd like to invite Daniela Behr from the World Bank. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miha, and thank you, Anna, for the invite. I'm really thrilled to be here, and this is just judging from the turnout, this is really timely, and it mirrors the importance of the topic that we will be discussing today. So thank you very much. I'm really thrilled. So before we get started, let me just share with all of you a number that I personally still find really hard to believe. As of today, nearly 2.4 billion women all around the world of working age do not have the same legal rights as men. And this means that the economic potential that the world still remains really untapped, with about half of the population not being able to fully participate. So let's get started and uncover where and how women still don't have the same rights as men. Next slide, please. So at the World Bank, we believe that no economy can achieve its true potential without equal involvement of both men and women. So the Women, Business and the Law project, where I'm part of and on behalf of which I'm presenting today, was founded in 2009. And since that time, we have been investigating the question, how do laws affect women's working life? And in order to answer this question quite comprehensively, we are relying on a network of over 10,000 legal experts all around the world who help us collect these data and who inform our analysis. So 4 years ago, we introduced a legal index, which is comprised of the following 8 indicators that you see on this slide, which kind of mirrors a woman's life cycle. It starts with mobility. Once a woman enters the workplace, the pay she receives, she decides to get married, parenthood, if she becomes an entrepreneur, entrepreneurship, assets, or pensions. So the WBL legal index, which is based on these 8 indicators, explicitly measures discrimination in the law. It measures the legal rights, but also the provision of certain benefits that affect women as she moves through her professional life. Each of this indicator represents a different phase, and overall we measure 35 questions that are scored across these 8 indicators. And these 35 questions are based on the international legal framework, such as the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or ILO conventions on work. We know that laws can promote or hinder women's economic participation because women face different limitations than men throughout their working lives. So the goal of the WBL index is really to demonstrate how laws affect women's prospects as both employees, but also as entrepreneurs. And we hope that with this index and with providing the data every year, we are inspiring legal reform in economies that are still lagging behind. Next slide, please. So why do we bother about legal gender equality? Why is the law important? So we do bother because mounting evidence indicates that laws captured by women business and the law are associated with greater economic empowerment for women. Aside from the core human right aspect, of course, greater legal equality is associated with a larger supply of female labor, smaller gender wage gap, higher levels of female entrepreneurship, and also a greater number of women in managerial positions. On the right-hand side, from recent research using data from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, we see that a discriminatory legal environment is associated with a greater probability that businesses led by women are operating in the informal sector. So now I really want to stress the importance here. The positive role that we see is not offset by some side effect, like legal gender equality does not hinder labor force participation of men. In fact, it really translates of larger workforce participation of everyone. So there is really at an aggregate level benefits for all. This means that reducing existing gender inequalities in the law is wise economic policy. Next slide. So in our latest edition of the 2022 report, we find that a global average score of women business and the law is 76.5 out of 100. This indicates that a typical woman only has 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men in the 8 areas that we measure. So this leaves us with 2.4 billion women of working age around the world not holding the same rights as men and not being afforded equal economic opportunity. So just to give you 2 examples, and we will dive deeper into those throughout the presentation. In 95 countries, women are not guaranteed equal pay for equal work. In 46 countries, as of today, women are not protected against sexual harassment in the workplace. And these inequalities contribute to a large earning gaps in which women's lifetime earning are just 2/3 of those of men. And a 2020 World Bank study finds that closing this large gap could add $172 trillion to the world's economy. And that's 2 times the annual GDP. So really, reducing inequality has tangible economic benefits for everyone. Next slide. As you can see on this slide, there's still a lot of work left to be done to advance gender equality across all regions. OECD high-income economies depicted on the top, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean score above the global average of 76.5. Other regions are furthest behind, and Middle East and North Africa, as well as South Asia, have the largest room for improvement on average. However, the score also shows the large divergence across regions, with every vertical blue line denoting an economy. So particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa, we see this like widespread between different countries, with the highest score and the lowest score ranging between 60 points. Most importantly, every region has examples of economies whose governments are implementing good practices. So good laws are everywhere. This means that countries can also look to their neighbors for examples when seeking input for how to reform their gender unequal laws. And most importantly, gender unequal laws are not preserved for high income economies. So gender equality is not an income question. Everyone can do it, and everyone has done it, as we will see. Next slide, please. When we take a closer look on the next slide at the indicator level, the mobility, workplace, marriage, entrepreneurship, and assets indicator have a global average of above 80, meaning that in most economies, they have removed restrictions or introduced the relevant legal rights and protections. Average scores are lower for pay, parenthood, and pensions. So just an example on parenthood here, the average score is 55.6, so just above half of what is possible. Overall, in WBL 2022, we find that 19 economies score 0 on parenthood, meaning that they do not have a single good practice in place, and that ranges from leave for mothers of at least 14 weeks, for instance. Next slide, please. Gradually, as countries are making progress, next slide, we see that there has been reform throughout. Despite the multi-layered crises that the world is currently facing, including a global pandemic, ongoing wars, and a looming climate crisis, 23 countries enacted 39 reforms to increase gender equality overall. If you could go back to the previous slide, Miha. And we see some examples outlined here on the slides. Most reforms were implemented in the Middle East and North Africa, which we've also previously seen was the region lagging most behind. I just want to mention one example which stands out in Western Africa and Central Africa, which is Gabon, which is undertaking a comprehensive reform to its civil code and also enacted a law to eliminate violence. And one of the issues that was most contested in the reform efforts in Gabon, which kind of nice lines in what Anna said in the beginning of our webinar, was removing the provision that only men can be head of household. However, they did it despite the opposition that they initially faced. So this shows that even under difficult circumstances, it can be done, and reform efforts are possible, and they do have an impact on women, men, and on the wider society. Next slide, please. So now let's take a look at the indicator level, starting with mobility. This indicator measures restriction to women's freedom of movement. And in particularly, we look at women's capacity to leave the home, to travel, to obtain a passport, and to choose where to live. However, we see that in 34 countries, women still cannot choose where to live the same way as men. Next slide. In the workplace indicator, we examine the ability of women to freely choose their employment, as well as protections against discrimination and sexual harassment. Globally, however, 46 economies still do not have legislation in place on sexual harassment in employment. Yet such legislation is really key to protect women, and it has significant impact on the labor market. An IFC study for Fiji, for instance, showed that on average, employees miss 10 working days a year due to the ramification of domestic and sexual violence. So it does not only impact employees negatively, it also translates in significant costs for businesses. Next slide, please. On pay, we see that worldwide, there are still 86 economies where women face some form of legal job restriction. In 53 economies, for instance, women cannot work jobs that are deemed dangerous. Restrictions such as these can really make it harder for women to gain employment in many often higher paying jobs, such as, for instance, in transport, manufacturing, energy sector, or in mining. But even when they can get jobs, women often get paid less than men. And this is often not mandated by the law. So we see that in half of the economies, 95 out of 190 economies still do not mandate equal remuneration for equal work. Next slide, please. Now let's move to the marriage indicator, which analyzes laws that can affect women during or after marriage. In 68 economies, women do not have the same right as men to remarry. is a good practice example. For instance, we showed Turkey that has also provided that women can be the head of household the same way as men. And this is important because if women cannot be head of household, they have less bargaining power at home, and this may also impair their aptitude to pursue a professional role outside the home. Next slide, please. So after marriage, women may also decide to start a family, and the parent indicator analyzes laws that affects women's right after pregnancy. 118 economies guarantee 14 weeks of paid maternity leave for the birth of a child, the minimum standard that is recommended by the ILO. On a global level, the total duration of paid leave available to mothers ranges really from 2 weeks to 98 days, so well below that average. And as measured by WBL 2022, 8 economies, including Georgia, and I hope we can hear more about this today, introduced reforms on family leave policies. Next slide, please. On the entrepreneurship indicator, we measure constraints on women's ability to start and run their own business. And this is important to highlight because women may face different hurdles when starting a business compared to men. Globally, however, there are still 104 countries that still do not prohibit gender-based discrimination and access to credit. And this disparity really can limit women's ability to make effective choices and transform their choices into economic opportunity. It can hinder women to register a business as a result of lacking finances. Next slide, please. In the assets indicator, we measure differences in property and inheritance right, and whether the law recognizes the value of non-monetary contributions, such as unpaid care for children in the household and household work. So we see in the area of assets, which is the red dotted line, that over the past 52 years, the number of reforms were rather low. In over 5 decades, the assets indicator has not really changed much, and it increased just by about 18 points. And this slow pace can be interpreted twofold. One, higher income economies such as the OECD countries, for instance, started off already at a rather higher score, whereas in other economies or in other regions of the world, reforming gender unequal laws related to inheritance and property ownership is inherently difficult as they are really embedded in social norms. Next slide. Last but not least, the pension indicator, which assesses laws regulating ages of retirement for both men and women and the size of pensions. So why is this an important area? Well, women face more barriers than men at the time of entering the labor market. They earn less. They will more often take leave to take care of children or relatives. And they often end up accumulating less benefits than men. So all of this, and considering that women live longer, women's pensions tend to be smaller and they are more likely to be poor during old age. And globally, 65 economies set different ages for men and women to retire and to receive full pension benefits. And the pension benefit gap on average is 4 years. From the map, we can see that the gap exists in every region of the world, ranging from 10 months in Lithuania for up to 10 years in China. Next slide, please. I just very briefly want to mention 2 areas that we're currently exploring under WBL that are not yet included in the index. And one of the new areas of measurement is childcare, which is one of the prerequisites for women to enter and stay in the workforce. And here we look at 3 pillars: availability, affordability, and quality services that create a safe and beneficial learning environment for children. So taking care of children should not be treated as a solely women's issue. But even before the pandemic, we were already a long way from closing the gender gap in unpaid care work. Globally, women did nearly 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men. Next slide, please. We have received a lot of feedback on our work over the years, pointing to the fact that going beyond the law and what is stated in the books is really important, and proper implementation and enforcement of the laws that I was just pointing out to you is really critical to removing the barriers of gender equality in practice. So we have started to work to trying to put forward a methodology of how to measure the implementation in practice. So stay tuned for future reports where we will be introducing these results. Next slide. I just briefly want to mention that we also on our website have linked quite a lot of deep dives on regions and country specifics. And I know the audience is very global. So if you're interested in seeing how your country scores, please visit the website and see your results for your country. On the final slide, on the next slide, we see that despite much progress, women still, as of today, only hold 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men. So a lot of work still lies ahead of us, and more needs to be done, and we know more can be done. It really needs a concerted effort of governments, civil society, and of course the private sector like yourselves to make sure gender equality is in fact a global phenomenon. Thank you so much, and I'm excited for the Q&A and for your questions.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Daniela. It's crucial to have good sets of laws to enable women, and it's my hope that more countries progress in the future. I really resonate as a South Korean. So from now on, I'll be giving the floor back to Anna to moderate the roundtable discussion with the 3 WEPs signatories that we invited from Georgia, South Africa, and Denmark. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miwa, and thanks so much, Daniela. I see already a lot of comments in the chat, congratulating you on an excellent presentation. I have also followed the comments in the chat, and I encourage all questions to come in the Q&A. It makes it easier for us to see what the questions are rather than comments. But I see that many people are interested in the practical side of the implementation of these laws, and we know that in some places they are strictly enforced, others that there are other type of informal laws that dictate what's happening in reality. But this is now an opportunity to hear from 3 of our WEPs signatories on how these laws have impacted their work. So we have 3 amazing panelists today. We have Alexander Sokolowsky from Prime Concrete. He is the founder and CEO in Georgia. We have Malisha Awunar, who is the group head of people and culture in EOH in South Africa, and Marissa Saretsky, vice president of global sustainability at Pandora in Denmark. I'm so excited to have you here, the 3 of you, so we can get into the practical implications on your companies. I will start with a question for you, Alexander. Based in Georgia, Georgia has introduced paid parental leave in 2021, as we heard from Daniela. How did that impact your company's policy? Did it impact your company's policies, and if so, how? Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you very much for this very nice opportunity to participate in this conference. Short answer is no, because actually we as a company introduced parental leave a few years ago ourselves without waiting for this law. Actually, we as a my company is in construction business, which is male-dominated business traditionally all over the world, and especially in Georgia. So we had this initiative to empower women and bring more women into construction business. So for us to introduce parental leave years ago was one of the initiatives and one of the incentives to offer to the market in order to attract more women. But generally speaking, law of course affecting a lot. I mean, the companies and women and men. I mean, to be employed, etc. But generally speaking, I mean, I was impressed with the presentation from World Bank about the law and about progress of Georgia. I mean, it has a quite a good rank, I believe. But I mean, in our case, laws are, I mean, introduction of laws we have a nice or progressive laws, but the problem is communication. I mean, and empowering, really delivering the essence of this law to the women and to the business to understand each other and really stimulate the process. I mean, to start bringing more women into the business or into the specific industries and into the specific locations, let's say. So I think law is okay. I mean, business is ready to accept this law because everybody is understanding that bringing the women into the business is absolutely necessary, and empowering the women is very effective, especially in my industry as well. And but the problem is communication. The problem is that education, and to give this information to the women and to the business that the law is changed and it's a benefit to everybody.
Thanks so much, Alexander, and for pointing out this point on communication and education. So that is also a role of the employer to kind of help raise awareness about new laws. So thanks for bringing this up. Very, very helpful.
Definitely.
So we'll, Malisha, in South Africa, you have progressive laws that enable women to work. How has it impacted your company and company like yours in South Africa?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I think, yes, we truly do have progressive laws, and the principles of the removal of discrimination is embedded in our constitution. And within our business, we've tried to ensure that our road to gender equity and equality moves beyond compliance. So we have a law called the Employment Equity Act, and this is about race and gender representation, and the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. In fact, all organizations, large organizations, are required to actually report on this on an annual basis. From our perspective, our inclusion strategy is based on the principle that an inclusive world is an enabled world. And just from a statistics perspective, our board, we have 45% women. We have 32% women in management, and overall in our business of just under 7,000 people, we have 43% women representation. So while we have all of this, the pay inequality is something we address over a period of time. We make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and pay parity is something that is part of our reporting that we do. From a terms and conditions perspective, we do have basic conditions of employment that says maternity leave is paid leave. So once a female goes on maternity leave, she can then draw benefits from our Unemployment Insurance Act. But this is limited because they can only really get 38% to 60% of their salary. And it's an admin nightmare for most people. And you can imagine becoming a new mom and having to stand in queues. So within our organization, we've extended fully paid maternity leave for a period of 4 months for our women. I think that being said, the business case for inclusion is sound. And in a report by Deloitte, they talk about inclusive organizations being more profitable, being more agile, being more innovative. And what we have tried to do in extending our enablement is that we've done a lot of work on trying to address systemic, social, and structural exclusion, because that is deeply embedded in our communities from a cultural perspective, primarily from a gender perspective. So the work we do around the space includes policies like a gender-based violence policy. We make sure that we have specific leadership interventions to be able to address this. And more importantly, we try to create a safe space for our women, and in fact, all of our employees, that is built on the principles of psychological safety. I think for me, companies need to review their practices beyond just the law. And that is why I'm a fan of, we don't just do things for compliance, we do it because it's the right thing. We need to ensure there's equal representation. And more importantly, we need to leave behind something better than what we've inherited, right, for our own girl children. So within our business, what we've also done is a very concerted effort on the principle of unconscious bias, because we can educate and we can communicate that this is what the law says. but we also need to give people with the tools that they need in order to understand things like bias, in order for them to understand their prejudice and how it actually plays itself out in the workplace from a teamwork perspective, from a decision-making perspective, or even having customer events where it's just a golf day as an example. That is a form of exclusion. So it's through very deliberate efforts around understanding what those structural exclusions are. We do a lot of work in the skills development space. So we are an ICT firm. And what we try to do is to make sure that our spend in relation to skills development is given or provided to the most marginalized women from our community. And it's important for us to build our own pipeline, because we can always say as a business, but there's not enough university graduates, there's not enough school leavers. So we try to target it at secondary school level already to try to make sure we commit to the step or the support of science and maths as an example. We provide bursaries in the ICT sector, and we make sure there's equal representation from a race and a gender perspective. We spoke, you spoke earlier about, Daniela, about small and medium businesses. And in enterprise development as well, we make sure that the gender representation is there, because it's one thing to depend on the private sector. It's more important to drive an economy. And the small and medium businesses, from what females can do, is a largely untapped market. And we have a very concerted effort to try to make sure that we put our money where it should actually be. So once again, driving beyond compliance. And I think laws are there, they're great, but I think we have a responsibility to do over and above to make sure that from a psychological perspective, from the unconscious bias perspective, from an organizational culture perspective, that we have an inclusive environment so all people can thrive. And we do, I know it sounds easy, but we do this through various partnerships. We're part of the United Nations Global Compact, and we make sure we use the accelerator programs to get our younger generation team members onto there to be able to educate ourselves and bring those ideas back into our organization so we can actually drive sustainable change. Thank you.
Malisha, thank you so much. We have a number of comments in the chat. Maybe you could look at it when we move over to Marissa. But many of them are commenting on the fact that you are attempting to go beyond the legislative norm. And particularly when it comes to maternity leave, that you're offering full paid maternity leave for 4 months. It is very important when people become parents. They already have additional cost, and then having a cut in their salary makes it even worse. So this is very good. We also have, and maybe everyone can address it in the Q&A later, but many are also talking about the role of men and how can men take up the parental leave to a large extent to leave women room to thrive at work as well. But I leave that for the Q&A session later on. And I think you also touch upon addressing issues prior to women entering into the labor market by working with secondary schools, etc. So we talked about the biases that are already shaping women and girls' choices for where they go. And Alexander, I am really happy to see that you are trying to attract women into your business so that women also have opportunities in otherwise male-dominated sectors. But we'll move on now to Marissa from Pandora, Denmark. And Denmark has scored 100 out of 100 on this Women, Business and the Law Index presented by Daniela. So how is this legal environment affecting your company's day-to-day business in terms of gender equality in Denmark? And how are you operating in other countries that does not have as advanced laws as in Denmark? Yes, over to you, Marissa.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today and for the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to go off of and springboard off of what Malisha was saying. That compliance is, you have to look beyond compliance, and the way I see it, regulation is the floor, right? That's not the ceiling. And so we have to see that as a starting point for taking a look at ourselves, within a company, our behavior, how we can best support the different underrepresented groups that we see and create this inclusive environment that Malisha was speaking to. So for example, I'll just give you an example, is around women in leadership, right? That's often a common topic that we talk about within companies. In Denmark, there is a law that specifies, gender parity in board composition and executive management groups. But that law in and of itself is quite limited in scope. If we look at that law, if we look at the board of directors, that's going to be, for most companies between, 8 and 12 people. If we look at executive management and the people who report into them, that's going to be around 15 people. That's quite a narrow scope if you think about it. So the approach we've taken at Pandora is to set a target that is global in nature, that is looking at all of the senior leadership of the company. So everybody in VP plus positions all the way up to board of directors, and saying, okay, we want to achieve gender parity in that group. It's a much broader scope of people that we're talking about in a company that has, around 30,000 employees, and strive over time to increase that number. So looking beyond compliance as a way of having a global impact. So that kind of also speaks to the nature of, okay, yes, there's this law in Denmark, but let's look at, the composition of our company and senior leadership in our company at a global scale, and see how we can help all of our leadership adjust and be more inclusive in terms of gender. And then there's the question of, numbers. So it's great that there's required disclosures around whether you're meeting these targets or not, but women are not just a number, right? And underrepresented groups, other underrepresented groups are not just a number. What matters as well is how they are treated in the workplace, whether they feel included. And some of you may have heard of the McKinsey Women in the Workplace report that just came out in 2022 at the end of the year, that said that women in leadership positions are leaving at unprecedented rates. So what does that say? Yes, it's okay to get them into those positions, but how do you keep them? How do you create the inclusive environment using men as allies in this endeavor to create and foster the culture that we want for equality and equity that we're seeking? So that's my first thinking. Then, as Pandora, the largest jeweler in the world, and thinking about the reach that we have to consumers across the world, for us, it has to go beyond compliance, because if you think about our marketing and our campaigns that are reaching millions of consumers around the world, and we have a lot of women that buy our jewelry. But it's not just about including women in the campaigns, because yes, we're selling to many of them. What stories are we telling in those marketing communications? How are we representing them? What stories, do we show to them about the possibilities of who they are, who they can become, and what they represent in society? And so right now, there's no legislation around what that looks like, right? And so that's why I think this notion of beyond compliance is so important, because again, we have a global reach here. We operate in more than 100 countries. So what we show the world through our marketing communications can have an impact on the story and representation of women in this world. And so a couple of concrete steps that we are taking to help in the marketing area. We are training our entire marketing organization on diversity and inclusion, what those behaviors look like. We've established a responsible marketing policy that addresses a lot of these issues, and we help them put that into practice. We also have unconscious bias training for our organization. Malisha was speaking to that as well, to help make sure that the behaviors that we all bring to the workplace are creating the culture that we want. And lastly, around women in particular, we've created some employee resource groups. We have one that launched just this past year called Women and Allies, and it's specifically geared towards, creating a community for women in the workplace to help create the culture that we want, and including all kinds of allies, whether it be different genders or other underrepresented groups, to engage them in that conversation. So those are the few initiatives that we're we have underway, and how we see the legal frameworks as supportive, but definitely not the end of the road.
Thank you, Marissa. And I see also very much response to this. Regulation is the floor and the starting point, and we see a lot of agreement in the chat. And you also touched upon how do we keep women? And I did read that report, and it is a big concern. What we have done from the WEPs side is to introduce one of the reporting indicators is retention, and retention particularly after childbirth, because that's where many women are falling out. But retention is a key indicator to how effective the policies in the company, the culture, the practices, how effective they are, is their retention rate. So if any indicator should be captured, is retention, because that's how you can measure the efficiency and effectiveness of your policies and practices. And also you touch upon marketing and communication. Principle 5 is addressing this issue. It's key, and it goes beyond the image of the company, but to have an opportunity to influence cultural norms, stereotypes, biases in the larger society with your communication and marketing. So you have a lot of power to establish a better and become a role model and establish better practices and how people view themselves. Particularly small girls, they see images of women always being at the home and being the caretaker at home, don't see themselves as a business leader. So it's important that we put progressive images of both women and men, and that men also are portrayed as the one taking care of the children and other dependent in the household. So
absolutely,
thanks very much for raising that point. We have so many questions. I'm not really sure where to start, but we have a very interesting question that I think all of you could tackle in some way. That Russia is saying that maternity leave is one of the main reasons why many women are not hired in the first place in the private sector, because it's seen as kind of a barrier for the company that will have cost implications. So that is one very interesting question. And I think also Daniela is asking if there is something you can elaborate a little bit more on the intersectionality lens. I saw in the chat, for example, in Colombia, women in their 50s are discriminated because of their age. And I know that in many European countries, it's also ageism is actually real, and women are discriminated. Is any one of you kind of tackling this issue? We also have many questions about equal pay for equal work. And if somebody has a little bit more light to shed on what does this concept mean? Does it mean that, let me see, that you need to fix the exact amount in the remuneration, or is it more about giving a range for each job category? So maybe we could start with these questions. There are many, many more coming in. I think everybody is very excited about this conversation. So maybe we could take a round. I don't know who would like to start on some of these questions. Malisha, thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll talk about equal pay for work of equal value. It's quite a topical issue. And I think for me, the important thing is, given the history, and it would be localized by country and by business, the gaps are rather large. So one, you need to have a very detailed strategic intent around what does it look like, and we work according to a pay range. We then agree what would the ideal pay range be. So we work on something called compa ratio. So we agree that 80 to 120% is an ideal compa ratio. from a gender perspective, anyone who falls below the 80% is where we need added attention. So it's not just 10 Rand or $10 for $10. It's about factoring in skill set and factoring in years of experience as well. Because you could have two people doing the same job, but someone much more experienced. And that does add a factor in terms of a pay difference. So to me, it's about being clear on what you want to achieve, making sure that it's fair and consistent across the various categories. And 3, which is most important, having a plan to remediate it, because a lot of organizations tend to back away from it because of the cost impact. But if you are clear in that within a 5-year period, we will sort this category of employee out, it makes it more achievable from an economic perspective. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much. Actually, there's, I'll add one question here from Valentina. I think also Daniela, maybe you'd like to touch upon this. If there is a parallel between the financial situation and the economic situation in a country and the use or non-use of existing legislation to achieve gender equality and reduced poverty. But thank you so much, Malisha. Anyone else that want to go next? Daniela?
Yeah, I can go next. Thank you very much. So there's so many interesting angles, and I'm very excited to see all this engagement, and I hope I can follow up bilaterally on some of the questions. So maybe let me start with the intersectionality, and then Anna, let me turn to your last question. So at Women, Business and the Law, we recognize that laws that we measure do not really apply to all women in the same way. Like, women face intersectional forms of discrimination, be it based on gender or sex, but also on like race, family status, age, as mentioned in the case of Colombia, but also ethnicity. And with regards to women with disability, we have started to explore how laws feature the right of women and women workers with disabilities as they face multiple and intersectional discrimination, lack of education, but also employment opportunities. And therefore, including like this rights perspective also of people with disabilities in the laws helps like get them and stay them in the workforce. And I've added a link, and thank you to my colleagues Alexis, who has also added it in the chat, to like first pilot data on women with disabilities that we collected under WBL. On the question on finance and do like richer countries do differently than poorer countries, and how do the laws feature in that case? So it's very interesting that the panel data that we have collected, which stretches 53 years, doesn't really show like that only high income countries have good laws. Quite the opposite. In fact, everyone and across all income groups, countries did implement reforms, because by now, like, we don't really have to argue anymore for it, right? We know it's wise economic policy, it can be done, and it has tangible impacts for women. Now, how these are implemented in practice is, of course, a different topic. And we have heard from like various countries and your experiences within the company, which may even be like different or like already more advanced than the laws that are outlined. So it really very much takes all stakeholders, the private sector in particular, to push forward to gender equality all across the world.
Thank you, Daniela. Marissa, do you want to go next?
Sure. I can just speak very briefly to the equal pay for equal work piece. You know, from our standpoint, we are subject to certain laws. Specifically, I'm thinking about UK law on disclosure of equal pay for equal work. That's just for the UK. And that actually, just to show how legislation can be the floor, not the ceiling, it sparked internal conversations around, well, if we're doing this for the UK, isn't this something that we need to be doing more globally, which is a huge undertaking, but it's something that we've set out as an ambition in our public DEI strategy to undertake over the next few years. And so using that as a springboard to drive the conversation internally, well, this is the right thing to do everywhere. Why wouldn't we look at this? And of course, it's, it's a very complicated topic, and it's something that, especially when you're starting to look globally and between countries, gets even more complicated. But I think it's something that having that ambition there and the willingness to look under the hood and see what you have is a way to do better. So just wanted to speak to that. But we're at the beginning of our journey.
Thank you, Marissa. Alexander?
Yes. In our case, in Georgia, I mean, as was discussed, I mean, we have progressive laws, but the country is still low-income country, and every business is struggling. I mean, everybody understands that the inclusivity and diversity is a way to get more stable and more profitable companies, but there is some limitation for companies to give beyond compliance. I mean, to give more to the employees. I mean, especially to the women. But in our case, I mean, we are as let's say in the construction business, it's a male-dominated business. We are trying our best to bring more incentives, and especially in the regional level, because there is also difference between capital and the regions. I mean, and in regions, I mean, the situation is a bit worse than in capital, of course. So we need some. We have a communication with the government. We have a communication within the business associations to try to find some other ways to stimulate the companies to bring more incentives for the women.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And I think that helped also answer some of the questions related to the economic situation of the country and how that impacts the ability to compliance or go beyond compliance. So thank you very much for that. We only have 3 minutes left. We have many questions, but there's a lot of questions that have sparked new conversations that often goes beyond the law. But panelists, feel free to look both in the chat and in the Q&A if you want to answer some of them directly. But I'd like to end with one question. Either for each of you, either a law that you think was particularly impactful in your country or in your market, or something that you wish would happen in the future. Some laws that would really help your company either grow or be able to more accommodate and drive gender equality within your company, either in the marketplace, in the workplace, marketplace, or community. Maybe we'll start with Malisha.
So mine is not so much from a law perspective, Anna. Mine is around getting the heads, hearts, and hands right around the fact that this is the right thing to do. And to me, all of the studies demonstrate that it is. And it's not an easy journey. It's not a comfortable journey, but nothing ever grows from comfort zones, right? And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that on this journey, those toolboxes that we need to put in place, and see there's lots of questions on DE&I training. We need to move away from the fads or the fashionable things and look at, for our particular area, what are the biggest pain points? And from a cognitive behavioral perspective, how do we actually change that? Because the reality is it's only through conscious effort by all parties, and I'm not just talking about private sector here, I'm talking broadly, can we affect the change? So mine is less about the laws and more about us all embracing the fact that we are in positions where we can affect that kind of change, and the change has to be sustainable.
Excellent, thanks, Malisha. Shall we go to Daniela?
Sure, no, it's very exciting to hear how existing laws affect the private sector and how, like, your companies are even advancing specifically on like a global level or like multi-corporate. I just want to outline, and again, I think I said this in the beginning, how shocking it is that if, as Marissa said, the law is the floor, some countries are in the basement, you know, like we still have like women all around the world who do not even have on a legal basis the same rights as men. And these affect 2.4 billion people as of today. And this is really like something we all need to work on and to make a big push that our next generation will not have to face the same issues.
Thank you, Daniela. Alexander?
Well, I cannot name any law which can improve the situation right now. We are, I think law is quite progressive, but again, I mean, more communication, more empowering, more education, this is what will help and really make this situation more sustainable with, I mean, every law should have some backup and support to be really implemented.
Thank
From
you,
both
Alex.
business and society.
Thank you. Yeah, it goes beyond business, and business have a key role in communication. Marissa, any final words?
Yes, I would just speak to, and this is maybe something that people think is really simplistic, but I actually do believe that transparency and required disclosures are a good lever to force change and to force uncomfortable conversations in companies. So whether that be, you know, the numbers, right? How many women are in leadership positions, or what do those pay equity numbers look like? Once you have numbers on paper and once you've disclosed them, then that leads to, well, how do these numbers look? What does it mean? Do we have the right behaviors in place? Do we have the right processes and policies to support what we want our company to look like? And taking a holistic look at the change that we want to see. And so just putting numbers on a piece of paper as a starting point, I think it's, at least, you know, from what I've seen, it is an effective lever. It's not the end all be all, because as Malisha was saying, we want sustainable change, and that takes much more than just putting in the right numbers.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And apologies to everyone, we are 2 minutes beyond time. I will very quickly wrap this up. I just wanted to make 2 points. One is to bring us back to the image of in the beginning of the webinar. We need to get to the root causes. We need to identify what is it. It's not about just recruiting more women. What is the root cause? What are the challenges that we need to address at its root? Only then will we be able to, thanks Miwa, will we be able to get to gender equality. And the second point is around transparency. I do agree that this is a very important issue of transparency and reporting. And what we have seen from the Web Secretariat is the fact that the CEO signs publicly the commitment to women's empowerment principles, communicate about it, also leads to accountability. We did a study that you will find on our website of the 350 largest companies in G7, which showed that web signatories that have made this public commitment actually are doing much better on 12 to 14 indicators than those that have not signed on to the women's empowerment principles. So already at that starting point, transparency matters to get that commitment out in the public. And we do encourage you, as I mentioned earlier, to also report on our platform, all the web signatories. We encourage, particularly on the retention, that you start collecting data against retention, because it is a very good indicator of how effective your other policies are in your company. So with that, we are now 4 minutes over time. So I would like to thank everybody from the participants that have been very active and had a lot of questions. We will review them afterwards and see if there is any bilateral conversation that we can pick up afterwards. We will also provide the recording on the website and a summary in a few weeks. that can help pull all this together. And I hope if for those that would like to listen to it again, there will be an opportunity to do so. And I would like to thank Alexander, Malisha, Marissa, Daniela, Miwa, and everyone that have contributed to the content of today's webinar. So thank you very much. And we would like to invite you to the next deep dive series, and you'll find them on our weps.org/events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.